Do you drink coffee?
I do.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
There you go.
That's
We'll
lovely.
have there. Oh, got it.
Oops.
This is very civilized.
Isn't this very relaxed? There are a few people here.
A few. Cheers.
Cheers.
But as an introvert, this is like my living room.
If we look as if we're wobbling off, can you rescue us?
So just don't mind us. How's life?
Pretty good, actually.
Seen any good movies lately?
Just trying to think.
You don't have to answer that.
Okay.
Actually, unless you want to know an answer. Sister Denise, just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Gosh, I'm a Franciscan missionary. I've had the wonderful privilege of being sent to Australia for 15 years, straight after uni, and that was an extraordinary experience. I suppose I grew up professionally there and left part of my heart there. Then I was hoping to go to Peru, because I became a missionary, believing God was leading me there. Do you know this God of surprises? And I asked if my next appointment could be Peru. I always say that our leader was hopeless, had no sense of geography, because she sent me to Zimbabwe. Wrong continent. And that was an extraordinary experience, and that's where I was sort of led through sickness into human rights full time. So it was extraordinary. And then fell in love with Zimbabwe and the people, wonderful people, and then was asked to come back to Ireland. And so kicking and screaming a bit because, I thought I was important and I was needed and I loved the work I was doing in my ministry. Then I worked with a wonderful group of missionary priests here, and it took me back all over Africa. So instead of being in Zimbabwe, so that was when I began to realize that so often when I kick against where I think God has got it wrong and maybe needs to listen to what I'm saying, I realize that it's not so. If I could just trust and let it unfold. And then from Ireland, then I landed up in Geneva for 5 years, linked with the UN, and that was very different. But again, it was from the grassroots of my experience in Zimbabwe, bringing it to the UN, the Human Rights Council. And then the Lord, this God of surprises, led me back to Ireland. I knew it was time to come back home. And I'm working now coordinating an international justice program.
And it's all to do with human rights, human trafficking, that's specifically that area? Or what areas do you concentrate on, or have you concentrated on over your decades?
I think probably women and children, because I originally started in secondary education and moved into adult education in Australia, administration. But in Africa, as part of my work for justice there, our leader said to me, the director of the organisation I was working with, he asked if I would set up a desk, as it was called, for women and children. And at that time in Zimbabwe, things have moved. I left in 2000, but the structure within the society was the male, the boy child, the cattle, women, and the girl child. So I suppose my Irish roots would always be tugged towards the underdog in some way. So these beautiful, vulnerable children, and part of some of the traditions which again are being eradicated. But of course, in any society, change is slow. But say, for example, there'd been an injustice between two families, and one person had died, say two men had a fight. In some parts of the country, the youngest girl child will be given to that other family in exchange for the death. And that's horrendous.
Yes, absolutely.
So, but there are wonderful human rights lawyers, local Zimbabweans who I was privileged to call friends and colleagues, who are fighting that case. So that's why I'm very quick to say that's 16 years ago, and things were definitely changing. But that I was there in 90, and those sort of things drew me into that work. And one of the most vivid cases that I suppose I was alternately so angry and it really fueled a passion was when this beautiful 11-year-old girl came into my office with her mum. And her mum was a very, very courageous woman. She was from an area in the western part of Zimbabwe, which was really quite traditional, and women didn't have a voice. But she knew the injustice her daughter had suffered, and they were too poor to pay for the money for this little girl to go to school. And sadly, she was going on an errand one day through the village, and a man caught her and took her into his hut, and he sexually abused her. And she was too frightened to tell her mother. So she went back home, and her mother knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. And tragically, he told a friend of his, who was a younger man, that he had caught this girl and it was fine, there were no consequences. So about 10 days later, the younger man was there during the day, because of course all her friends and her brothers and sisters were at school. She was the youngest in the family. And he took her to his hut, and she was raped again. And this time she did tell her mother, because she was ill and sick and needed medical attention. And her mother took it to court, rather than the two families trying to agree to some sort of compensation, a cow or a certain amount of money. And what happened was that one of the men, or both, bribed the magistrate. So the court, as they brought the court document to me, this very provocative, sexualized teenager, she was only 11, had caused her own problem. So we were lucky enough, we had a wonderful human rights court judge. And whilst the actual verdict couldn't be changed, it's Roman Dutch law, what he did was he took the case up. And, when I went to the village, and this little girl ran to me and clung to me, she was just really a very young 11-year-old. And to see justice come about, the magistrate was given a white paper, and 3 white papers and you lose your job. So there are great people working together. So I became part of a team, and that was great.
And I mean, as a Franciscan sister, right? I mean, would you consider yourself a sister or an activist, or a little bit from column A and column B, or how would you view yourself?
I'd say both.
Both?
I think it's who I am.
Yeah.
My mother was a very strong, honest person,
yeah,
who lived through the 1916 rising. So, yes, I don't think it's either or.
And why do you think you have such a special interest in the advocacy towards children and women? What is it about yourself that you feel drawn to that?
Well, I think children are the most vulnerable in our society, in any society. And I think that the injustices that have been perpetrated in all countries against women in different ways, if you think of suffragettes, if you think of equality, equal pay, there are so many ways. And right now, if you think of rape as a weapon of war, on wars that they had no decision in calling or deciding on, I think all of those factors would, and somehow circumstances. I was saying to Anne earlier, and yourself, Greg, I believe very much in a God of surprises, and somehow circumstances unfold. I also believe that when we're feeling most lost or uncertain, like when I came back from Zimbabwe to Ireland, things do unfold. I believe that. It's hard when we're in the midst of it.
Yeah.
But suddenly there's the right person, the right situation. We have to seize the moment. I think that's important. And I think that comes out of prayer, a sensitivity. I know when I'm not praying, we can all do stupid things, but sometimes I think, if only I'd paused a moment, if maybe I hadn't been so quick to comment. And often it's, I need to spend a bit more time in prayer.
And earlier you talked about your anger a little bit. Does your anger fuel your prayer, or do you think your prayer fuel your anger towards acting out against injustices?
That's a really good question.
Thank you.
And I'm not sure of the answer. I think anger can be unproductive. I think there is a just anger, but I'd hope that it becomes passion that is thought through, sensitive, and therefore more productive.
Right.
I think we all know when we lash out in anger. When you asked me earlier what are the 2 areas I'm working on, we're opposing human trafficking globally, and that would be modern slavery, and also cosmology eco-justice. And there's a very interesting experiment that has emerged. I think we know it instinctively, but my inner climate, the sort of person I am, can have a huge impact on my outer climate. And there's something about our world being on the brink of destruction because we're not addressing that inner climate. Let me just explain. We all know when someone comes towards us who's really angry. We can feel the vibes, can't we? Equally, we know when someone's coming towards us who's calm, and there's just something about them that is attractive, or we just feel comfortable with them. So, that idea that some people have green fingers and they talk to the plants. I think it's more their presence and their breathing, and whilst both those areas, they're very different, they're both underpinned by poverty and abuse, we're now seeing an interconnectedness. So the rape and exploitation of people, I heard last week that tragically in Ireland, 25% of those calling the Rape Crisis Centre were men and youth. But only 1 in 20 will report. 75% were women, but only 1 in 10 will report. So that's actually happening in our society here. But equally, the way we're exploiting this beautiful gift of our created world, Mother Nature, in all its fragility, we have to, as Pope Francis said, we have to take responsibility. It is the crisis of our time. There's no plan or planet B. So the two actually combine.
Very good. And maybe just to bring it back home a little bit more, over the last decades and over the last few years in particular, there's been an uncovering of just a huge, a massive amount of child abuse and perpetrated by our church. And I talk about our traditions collectively. As someone who is an advocate for women and for children, that must have broke your heart.
Yeah, and it's there is no way we can condone it under any circumstance. I think it was a tragedy for those involved, and it impacted on their whole lives, as we know, and that was irreparable damage. And then there's the whole damage to those entrusted with the children, and the betrayal of trust. And I think, as one of our earlier speakers said, we have to earn that trust. And I think it showed how I like to think of church with a capital C actually meaning all of us, and a small c, the buildings, the structure. And that small c has to be challenged at every level. Unless we're a church of truth, transparency and integrity, we don't deserve the title of being gospel people. And that's, I think Pope Francis is a wonderful example of very much a Jesus figure. He's not trying to change all the laws, just as Jesus didn't change the law of the time. What he did change was his whole attitude of compassion and love. And I think Francis is doing that. As we're actually speaking, Greg, Francis is in Lesbos with maybe the most vulnerable in our world today, the migrants. And actually, Mercy International were part of a national coalition. Our government said we could bring in at least 4,000 Syrians. That was last October. Do you know how many we've brought in? 20. It's just absolutely unforgivable. Yeah. And the people of Ireland, if you remember that marvellous surge, and it's still there, of openness and wanting to share and offer hospitality and hope with, I've got a granny flat, I've got a spare room, you're most welcome. We haven't capitalised on that as a government. So we're just waiting for the new government to challenge and say, we have to open our doors. And it's not so long in our own history. Doors were opened all over the world to Irish people. Yeah. So, there are so many layers of that.
And is that how we begin to readdress and recreate and those bridges back to trust when it comes to the church and people of faith? Because when the church disintegrates or severs that trust, inevitably people think they're severing that trust with God as well, because we do represent God badly. But we're also the first port of call when it comes to, you're a Christian, thus you represent God. If you betray me, thus God must betray. How do we, as people of faith, begin to reestablish that trust that seems so necessary and integral to societal well-being?
That's the critical question. I think it comes back to something about living my life with integrity and as honestly and openly as I can. And I believe it's walking with. I think the days of pedestals, here we are sitting up on pedestals, sorry.
I love it up here.
Power. I think those days have gone, and absolutely they needed to go. I've met the most amazing women and men in the church. Listening to Imelda this morning, it was just so inspirational.
Amazing.
Listening to our other speakers, the passion, the beauty, the music, the challenge. I think that's the church that's emerging. And I think a hierarchical, and I was going to say dressing in different things that make people very much apart from rather than with. Peter McVerry was in our parish a few weeks ago.
He sat here last year, literally, having a similar conversation.
There are so many inspiring people. Humbly, honestly, listening to him on the radio, just the integrity, but he walks the talk. And I think that's what each one of us has to do and try to do in our lives.
Maybe just more of a personal question. Do you want to take that from you?
I'm hanging on. It's good comfort, security blanket.
And it's warm, right?
It is.
Maybe even more personally, you've been a sister for how long?
Oh, too long to say. Many moons.
Many moons. Works for me. Where do you find God, or where does God find you?
I think I love nature. I love people. And I think so often just it can be the stranger, the friend, the person who's just there when I'm upset, or I think God is in those situations. I find I'm very conscious of God in my life when I'm facing challenges, because I believe we're inspired by the Spirit, that still small voice. And I know when I go against that, so often why did I do that? Why? And I need time for prayer when, in a sense, I see my day as an unfolding of that time when I try and sit. I'm a morning person, so just to sit quietly for half an hour, and I have a beautiful view out my window, just clouds. I've always loved clouds and the sky. I need something to remind me that this isn't just me sitting there. And sometimes it's in a book or a film. I think God is literally everywhere. But there are certain times, and for me, I need to daily step outside. The busyness, the rush, But this morning was such a lovely day. I said, let me walk and just bus a little. And it was beautiful just walking in a fresh morning. So I think it's literally God is all around us.
So just in closing, looking out here, we have 100 people. How do we engage daily in reestablishing that trust and acting for justice and establishing peace? What would you say to us if we say we want to participate more? How would you encourage us to do so?
Gosh, that's a tough one. I think Pope Francis, he was Cardinal Bergoglio, I can never pronounce that, but in the cardinals met together before the last conclave when they gathered to elect the Pope. And each of the cardinals was invited to speak for 5 minutes on what was needed in the new Pope. And one of the last to speak was this Cardinal Bergoglio. He spoke for 3 minutes, and they said it was absolutely electrifying. And this is partly the answer. I think it's the beginnings of an answer. I haven't got the full answer, obviously. But he said several things, and two of them that really struck me was, one, he said, a church community or a church that looks inside becomes narcissistic and loses the message of the gospel. But the church who goes on a surge of hope and compassion to the periphery, that's where together we discover the Jesus of the gospel. And I think the very fact today he's witnessing that, being with the most vulnerable Syrians who've escaped death, torture, endured horrendous situation to get to Greece and hope, and with their children. And look how many have died, drowned in that process. So we can't all be in Lesbos, but wherever we are, I think it's something about being open to the gift of this present moment. So the person who comes into my life now, I live in community with 4 other women. We sometimes say it's a miracle that 5 independent women can live together. But I know sometimes I'm not as present to one sister in particular as I could be. And just this morning she came out before I left, and she was so beautiful. She said, I remember a prayer, let me look at you, do you look okay? And just was so warm and loving. And I think it's that love that somehow trying to stay plugged in to whoever our higher power is. For me, it's Jesus and the Spirit very much. And at the same time, trying to live my life as fully as I can in this present moment. You know, the negative murmurings, I wish I had, and why didn't I? And, you know, we have that row inside ourselves, all the things we should have said. Letting go of that helps me personally to live more fully now and being open. And I think then it will unfold, whether collectively as a community you support a particular project, or I don't think we can all be out on the streets with the homeless. But I do think that we can find the vulnerable right across society, and where right now I'm located or working or situated. I think that's the beginning of an answer, Greg.
Thank you.
Not the whole.
Thank you very much. What an honor. Thank you for your time today. Please put your hands together. Denise Boyle. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.